The letter arrived on a Tuesday, which was already suspicious, because nothing good ever came to Thornfield Creek on a Tuesday. Theodora Keating stood on the platform of the Abilene train station with her single leather trunk, her good wool traveling coat buttoned to her chin against the October wind of 1878, and she watched the crowd thin around her until she was standing almost completely alone. The westbound passengers had collected their families and their baggage and their futures and walked off into the Kansas afternoon, and still no one had come for her. She had the letter in her coat pocket, folded into thirds the way she always folded correspondence, neat and precise, because Theodora Keating had been precise her whole life. She had been precise about her needlework, about her ledger columns at her father's dry goods store back in Cincinnati, about the words she chose when she spoke. Precision was the armor she wore, and she wore it well. The letter was from one Marcus Slater of Thornfield Creek, Kansas, cattle rancher, widower, 32 years old. He had answered her advertisement in the Matrimonial Gazette, or rather she had answered his, and after 4 careful, measured letters exchanged through the autumn of 1877 and the spring of 1878, they had reached an agreement. She would come west. He would meet her at the station. They would marry within the week. That had been the arrangement. The arrangement, apparently, had not been communicated to the man standing across the platform from her, who was leaning against the station wall with his hat pulled down and his arms crossed, watching her with the expression of a man who had drawn the short straw and was not pleased about it. He was tall, lean through the middle, with dark hair curling slightly at his collar, and he had the weathered look of someone who spent most of his life under an open sky. He was maybe 27 or 28, with a strong jaw that he was currently holding very tight. He pushed off the wall and walked toward her with the unhurried stride of someone who had practiced being calm about things he was not calm about. "Miss Keating," he said. "That is correct," she said. He took his hat off, revealing those dark eyes fully, and they were not unkind. They were, in fact, rather extraordinary, dark brown edged with something that might have been remorse if she had known him well enough to read it that way. "My name is Daniel Slater," he said. "I'm Marcus's brother. He asked me to come meet you and bring you out to the ranch." Theodora looked at him steadily. She had crossed 3 states on 3 separate trains. She had left behind everything she knew, every familiar street and familiar face, her father's store and her mother's grave, and the life she had built on precision and practicality in a city that had, ultimately, offered her very little in the way of a future. She was 24 years old, and she had done a brave and terrifying thing, and she had done it expecting to be met by a particular man. "Your brother," she said, keeping her voice entirely level, "made a specific commitment to meet me himself." Daniel Slater looked at her with those extraordinary eyes, and something in them shifted. "Yes, ma'am, he did. And yet here you stand." "Yes, ma'am, here I stand." She studied him for a moment. He did not look away, which she respected. A man who could hold her gaze under those circumstances had a backbone at least. "Then I suppose," she said, "we should collect my trunk." The wagon ride out to Thornfield Creek took the better part of 3 hours, and it was not comfortable. The Kansas plains stretched out in every direction, brown and gold in the late October light, vast in a way that made her chest feel strange, like the space was trying to get inside her and rearrange things. She had never seen land that went on like that. In Cincinnati there were always buildings, always another street, always something to stop the eye. Here the sky sat right down on the earth, and there was nothing between you and it. Daniel drove, and she sat beside him on the wagon seat, and they were quiet for a long time in the way of 2 strangers who had been thrown together by circumstances neither of them had chosen. "How far is the ranch?" she asked, eventually. "Another hour, maybe. We lost time waiting at the station." There was something in the way he said it that made her look at him. "You were waiting for some time." He kept his eyes on the road. "I got there early. Wasn't sure which train you'd be on." That was considerate, actually. She noted it and filed it away. "Why didn't your brother come himself?" she asked. Daniel Slater was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer. The horses pulled steadily, their breath clouding in the cold air, and the wagon wheels found every rut in the road. "Ranch business," he said finally. "Ranch business," she repeated. "We're in the middle of fall roundup. He couldn't leave." "He knew when I was arriving," she said. "We established the date in correspondence." "Yes, ma'am." "The date did not change." "No, ma'am." "So the roundup was also scheduled in advance." He glanced at her then briefly, and there was something in his expression that was almost like appreciation. "You're direct." "I find it saves time," she said. He returned his eyes to the road and was quiet again for a moment. Then he said, in a tone that was lower and more honest than anything he'd said before, "The truth is, Miss Keating, I don't fully know why he didn't come. I know what he told me. I'm not certain it was the whole story." She appreciated that more than she could say. She turned and looked out at the prairie and let herself feel, just for a moment, the full weight of the situation she had landed herself in. She had come across the country to marry a man she had never met, based on 4 letters that had been thoughtful and responsible, and not once warm. She had told herself that warmth was something that grew, that warmth was not the thing to optimize for when one was being practical about one's future. She had told herself many sensible things. Looking out at that enormous Kansas sky, she thought that perhaps sensible things were not the only things worth telling yourself. The Slater ranch was larger than she had expected. It sat in a gentle valley between 2 low rises, the main house solid and square, built from timber and stone that had been there long enough to look permanent. There were outbuildings, a barn, corrals where horses stood in clusters, and farther out she could see the dark shapes of cattle moving slowly through the brown grass. A thin column of smoke rose from the house chimney. The place had the look of something that worked hard and took itself seriously. Daniel brought the wagon around to the front of the house, and a woman came out onto the porch, wiping her hands on her apron. She was perhaps 50, broad-shouldered, with gray-streaked hair pulled back severely and eyes that missed nothing. "That's Mrs. Aldine Briggs," Daniel said quietly. "She keeps house for Marcus, has done for 3 years. She won't bite, but she won't warm to you fast either. Give her time." Theodora filed that away too and stepped down from the wagon before Daniel could come around to help her, not out of rudeness but out of the habit of doing things herself. "You must be the bride," Mrs. Briggs said, in a tone that suggested the word contained a question she hadn't decided whether to ask. "I must be," Theodora said, and walked up the porch steps with her spine straight. "Theodora Keating, it's good to meet you." Mrs. Briggs studied her for a second, then nodded, short and decisive. "I'll put on more coffee." Marcus Slater did not come in until supper, and when he came in, he brought the cold of the evening with him and the smell of cattle and hard work, and he filled the doorway in a way that made the room feel smaller. He was nothing like what Theodora had pictured from the letters. The letters had been careful and measured, and she had constructed from them a careful, measured sort of man, someone thoughtful, someone interior. The man who stood in the doorway was large and blunt and deeply uncomfortable. He was 32, as advertised. Broad across the shoulders, with the kind of sun-darkened face that came from years of working without cover, and gray already coming in at the temples of his dark hair, and green eyes that were, she had to admit, striking. He looked at her the way someone looks at something unexpected in a familiar place, not unkindly but with a kind of wariness. "Miss Keating," he said, "I apologize for not meeting you myself. The work ran over." "Your brother mentioned the roundup," she said. "Yes." He came to the table and sat down, and there was no warmth in the room and no ease, and Theodora thought that she had made a magnificent and possibly catastrophic mistake. Supper was quiet. Daniel sat across from her and was the only person at the table who made any real effort at conversation, asking her about the train journey, about Cincinnati, about whether she had traveled much before. Marcus answered her questions when she directed them at him, and his answers were not unfriendly, but they were not the answers of a man who was glad she was there. They were the answers of a man fulfilling an obligation he had set in motion and was now not entirely sure he wanted to see through. She went to bed in the spare room that Mrs. Briggs had made up for her, under a quilt that smelled of cedar, and she lay in the dark and thought about the 4 letters. She thought about how she had read them and reread them, and found in them a kind of quiet steadiness that she had told herself could become something more. She thought about whether she had invented a man from those letters, whether she had wanted him to be a certain thing so badly that she had made him that thing in her own imagination. The wind came up during the night and pushed at the walls of the house, and she fell asleep to the sound of it, prairie wind, the sound of a world that did not care about her plans at all. The next morning she was up before anyone else. She found her way to the kitchen, located the coffee pot, the range, the tin of ground coffee, and had a pot going by the time Mrs. Briggs came in and stopped short in the doorway. "I can do that," Mrs. Briggs said. "I know you can," Theodora said. "So can I. Where do you keep the flour?" That turned out to be the right thing to say. Mrs. Briggs looked at her for a moment with something that was almost respect and then pointed to the cabinet. By the time Daniel came in at 6:30, there were biscuits browning in the oven, and the kitchen smelled like something worth coming home to. Daniel leaned in the doorway and looked at the biscuits and then looked at her. "You cook," he said. "Among other things." He sat down at the table and poured himself coffee and said, "Marcus left at first light. He'll be out until dark again most likely." She turned back to the oven. "I see. He's not always like this," Daniel said, and she could hear in his voice that he meant it. "The fall roundup is genuinely brutal this year. We're short 2 hands and it's later in the season than we wanted. He's worried about the cattle." "I didn't come here to be a burden," she said. "I understand ranch work has its seasons. You're not a burden. That's not what I meant." "I know it's not what you meant." She pulled the biscuits out and turned to look at him. "I'm just saying that I'm not made of glass. I grew up in a store. I understand work." He looked at her steadily and then he said, with a quiet frankness that she was beginning to recognize as simply the way he spoke, "I think you might be good for this place." "I haven't done anything yet." "No," he agreed, "but you made biscuits." In spite of everything, she laughed. It was a real laugh, brief and surprised, and it felt like something releasing in her chest that had been wound tight since the train platform in Cincinnati. The days settled into a rhythm of sorts. Marcus left early and came back late, and on the evenings when he made it to supper on time, they talked carefully around each other like 2 people navigating a room full of things that might break. He was not cruel. He was not cold, exactly. He was simply distant in a way that she could not find the edge of, could not find the seam in to pull at and understand. He answered her questions. He thanked her for the meals she helped prepare. He showed her where things were and explained how the ranch worked in brief, informative sentences. But he never once asked her a question about herself. Not about Cincinnati, not about her family, not about why she had answered a matrimonial advertisement in the first place. It was as though he was afraid of what the answers might do to him. Daniel, on the other hand, asked her everything. He was curious in the natural, open way of someone who had never learned to be guarded about it. And she found herself telling him things she had not planned to tell anyone. About her mother who had died of fever when Theodora was 16, and how she had run the household after that. About her father who was kind but overwhelmed, and had remarried by the time Theodora was 20 to a woman who was also kind, but who made the house feel crowded in some fundamental way. About the ledger work and the way she had liked the numbers because they always balanced, because there was always a right answer if you worked hard enough to find it. And marriage. Daniel said one afternoon when they were both out at the barn and she was watching him work on a piece of tack that had come loose. "Was that a numbers thing too?" She leaned against the stall door and thought about it honestly. "In some ways," she said. "The advertisement was practical. I answered it practically. And now that you're here," she looked out through the open barn door at the wide Kansas sky. It was November by then, and the sky had that deep cold blue that feels like the inside of a bell. "Now that I'm here," she said slowly, "I'm not sure practical was the right framework." Daniel was working a leather lace through a buckle, not looking at her. "What framework would you use now?" She thought about her answer for a long time, long enough that he looked up. "Honesty," she said finally. "I think honesty might be the better framework." He held her gaze for a moment, and something moved through those dark eyes of his, something that she did not entirely know how to name, and then he looked back down at the leather work and said, "That seems right." She realized, sometime during that second week, that she had stopped counting the days until the wedding the way you count down to an event you have committed to, and had started simply living each day as it came. She helped Mrs. Briggs with the house. She took the mending that piled up in a basket by the parlor window and worked through it with the steady efficiency that was simply how she did things. She walked the perimeter of the yard each morning, getting her bearings, learning the lay of the land. She met some of the ranch hands, weathered men who touched their hats and were polite in the brief, contained way of men who did not know what to make of an Eastern woman who appeared to be taking stock of everything. She met old Pete, who had been with the Slater ranch since before Marcus's father died, and who had the comfortable authority of someone who had outlasted everything and knew it. He told her about the country, about the winters, about the way the creek flooded sometimes in the spring, and the year the prairie fire came close enough that they had to wet down the outbuildings. He told her about Marcus's wife, Abilene, who had died of pneumonia 3 years before, and how she had been quiet and gentle, and had loved the ranch in a way that surprised people because she had come from a town family. "He didn't take it easy," old Pete said, matter-of-factly, not unkindly. "Losing her. He went inward and he hasn't fully come back out." Theodora turned this over in her mind and held it carefully. It was on a Thursday, the second week in, that things shifted. She had been working at the kitchen table on the ranch's supply ledger, which Mrs. Briggs had confessed was in a state of some disorder, and she was so absorbed in untangling 2 years of imprecise record-keeping that she did not hear Marcus come in from the cold until he was standing at the kitchen doorway. She looked up, startled, and saw that he was staring at the ledger spread across the table, at her neat columns filling in the margins. "What are you doing?" he said, and his voice had something in it that was not quite accusation but was close. "Your accounts are about 6 months behind and one of your suppliers has been overcharging you," she said, because that was the honest thing to say. "If you want, I can leave it, but I've almost untangled the March through June discrepancy." He stood there for a long moment, and she watched him decide something. Then he pulled out the chair across from her and sat down, and for the first time he looked at her not like an obligation and not like something unexpected and wary-making, but like something real. "Show me," he said. She showed him. She walked him through the columns, through the supplier invoices she had found stuffed in the back of the ledger box, through the 4 months in which a grain merchant had been rounding up consistently and subtly, the kind of thing you would never notice unless you were looking at the full picture. Marcus listened and asked questions, real questions, smart questions, and she revised her estimate of him upward. When she finished, he sat back and looked at her. "Where did you learn to do that?" he said. "My father's store," she said. "I managed the books from the time I was 17. He was quiet for a moment. "You're good at it. Numbers are honest," she said. "They tell you exactly what happened." Something happened in his face then. A very small thing, a shift, like a window somewhere opening slightly. "That's an interesting way to put it. It's how it seems to me." He got up and went to pour himself coffee, and when he came back to the table he didn't sit down immediately but stood looking at the ledger, and she could see that he was thinking about something that was not the ledger at all. "I owe you an apology," he said finally, "for not coming to the station myself. Your brother explained about the roundup. The roundup was real," he said. "It wasn't the whole reason." He set the coffee down and looked at her directly in a way that cost him something. She could see it costing him. "I was afraid to come." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the wind was doing what it always did, running across the prairie and finding every crack in the walls to push at. "Afraid of what?" she asked, keeping her voice gentle. "Of it being real," he said. "Of standing there on that platform and seeing a woman who had given up her life to come here, and knowing that I had written those letters, and not being certain anymore that I was the man in those letters." He stopped. "Abilene died 3 years ago, Before I placed that advertisement, I was certain it was time. By the time you wrote back, I wasn't as certain, and by the time we'd fixed a date, I was." He stopped again. "Afraid," she supplied. "Yes." She thought about this carefully. She looked at the man across from her, at the honest, uncomfortable lines of him, at the way he held himself like someone braced for something. "Mr. Slater," she said, "I came here because I was also afraid. I was afraid of a life that was becoming smaller year by year in a city that had no particular use for a capable, direct woman of 24 who didn't particularly want the life it was offering. I came here because I thought I could build something different. I'm not here because I've already made up my mind about you." She paused. "I haven't, and I suspect you haven't made up your mind about me either." He looked at her. "No," he said, "I haven't." "Then perhaps," she said, "we could simply begin." It was not romantic as beginnings go, but it was honest, and honest was the framework she had decided on, so it suited her. The next day he came in for supper on time. The day after that he was there again. He started asking her questions, tentative at first, about Cincinnati and the store and her family, and she answered them the way she did everything, directly, without embellishment. And he listened the way a man listens when he is genuinely interested and knows it, and is not sure what to do with the interest. Daniel watched all of this with an expression that was carefully neutral in the way of someone working to keep it that way. He was kind to her and easy to be around, and she found his company genuinely pleasant, but she noticed that there was something slightly restrained in him now when Marcus was in the room, something that had not been there before, and she filed it away and did not quite know what to do with it yet. One evening near the end of November, when Marcus was at the table after supper going over the corrected ledger and asking her to walk him through a calculation, Daniel got up from his chair by the fire where he had been quietly reading and said he was going to bed early. He said it without drama, and the door to the hallway closed quietly behind him, and Marcus looked up for a moment and then looked back at the ledger, and Theodora thought that there were currents in this house that she only partially understood. She went looking for Daniel the next morning, found him in the stable, and said simply, "Are you all right?" He looked up from the horse he was brushing, and the careful neutrality was there again. "Fine," he said. "Why do you ask?" "Because you've been quieter." He stroked the horse's neck and was quiet for a moment. "It's good," he said. "You and Marcus. It's good to see him paying attention again. I've been trying to get him to wake up for 3 years. That's not what I asked." He looked at her, those dark eyes always honest, and she could see him deciding something in them, the way she had seen Marcus deciding something 3 weeks before. "I had more practice than him," he said finally, "at looking at you without anything behind it, and then I stopped being able to do that as easily, and I decided the right thing to do was give it some distance." He said it plainly, without drama, the way he said everything. "That's all." Theodora stood in the stable doorway and felt the weight of what he had just said settle around her like snow, quiet and complete. "Daniel," she said, and she said it carefully. "Don't," he said, and he said it kindly. "You don't need to say anything. I'm telling you because I think you're honest enough to deserve it, not because I want you to do something about it. You came here for Marcus, I know that. He's beginning to see you. That's what matters." She looked at him for a long time, and she thought about honesty, and about the different kinds of feelings that can be real and true and still not be the right thing to act on, and she thought about how much she had already come to value this man's straightforwardness and quiet decency. "Thank you," she said, "for everything you've done since I stepped off that train." "It was self-interested," he said, with a brief flicker of a smile. "I wanted someone to make those biscuits." She smiled back, and there was something bittersweet in it, clean and honest and complete, and she walked back to the house, and she felt the cold Kansas air in her lungs like a clarifying thing. That evening Marcus found her in the parlor, sitting by the lamp with her mending, and instead of sitting at the table with papers he came and sat in the chair across from her, and for a while neither of them said anything, and it was a different kind of silence than the silences of those first days. It was not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that means something. "Tell me about your mother," he said, which surprised her. She looked up. "What made you think of her?" "You told Daniel about her the second week. I wasn't trying to overhear. The door was open." "She was remarkable," Theodora said, setting down the mending. "She had this quality of paying full attention. Whenever you were talking to her, you felt like the only person in the world worth listening to. She died of typhoid fever when I was 16, and there was a way in which the house lost that quality when she was gone. It became just walls and furniture." He was quiet, listening. "I think I decided somewhere in my teenage years that if I could not have that quality, I would have precision instead. I would be useful. I would be reliable. I would balance all the ledgers." She paused. "It got me through a lot." "But," he said, and the word was gentle. She looked at him. "But I started to wonder if the ledger of my own life was missing some columns." He leaned forward with his elbows on his knees and looked at his hands for a moment, and then looked up at her. "Abilene was sick for 2 winters before she died," he said. "The second winter, when it was clear it was going to end the way it ended, she made me promise not to shut down. She used those exact words. 'Don't shut down, Marcus.' She knew I would. 'Did you promise?' I promised. And then I shut down completely," he said, and there was a roughness in his voice. "And I held onto the promise and the ranch work, and I wrote careful letters to a woman in Cincinnati, and I told myself that was enough, that was keeping the promise close enough." The lamp threw soft light across the planes of his face, and she could see all the things he carried in it, the grief and the guilt and the stubborn, contained feeling that had not gone away even after 3 years of being contained. "I don't think she would have wanted the letter version," Theodora said gently. He looked at her. "No," he said. "She wouldn't have. She would have wanted you here," she said. "In this room, talking." Something moved across his face that was not quite grief and not quite relief and was entirely its own thing. He straightened up and looked at her, really looked, and she held his gaze without looking away, and the parlor was warm and the lamp was bright, and outside the Kansas wind was doing its eternal work, and something between them shifted into place like a piece of a problem finally finding its right answer. He did not say anything dramatic. He said, "I'm glad Daniel went to get you," she said. "So am I." December came in with a vengeance, which Marcus had told her it usually did. The first big snow fell on the 2nd of the month, and it fell for 2 days, softening the edges of everything, covering the prairie in a white so complete it made the sky look gray by comparison. She stood at the kitchen window on the morning of the 2nd day and watched it come down and felt, for the first time, that this land was genuinely beautiful. Marcus came up beside her with 2 cups of coffee and handed her one without asking if she wanted it, because she always wanted it in the morning, and he had learned that, and she noted that he had learned it with a warmth that spread all the way through her. "It's something, isn't it?" he said, looking out at the snow. "It is," she agreed. They stood together at the window and drank their coffee, and the snow kept falling, and at some point his shoulder was touching hers, which was warm and solid and unremarkable in the way that the best things become once they become familiar. "I'd like to be married before Christmas," he said. "If you're willing. If that's not too soon." She turned to look at him. His eyes were on the snow, slightly careful, the way he was when he had said something that mattered and was waiting to see how it was received. "It's not too soon," she said. He turned to look at her then, and smiled, and it was the first full smile she had seen from him, the kind that reached everything, and she thought that for all his shutting down, whatever had been behind the shutting was extraordinary when it came out. She filed that thought in a place she would keep returning to. The wedding was on the 19th of December, 1878, in the parlor of the Thornfield Creek Methodist Church, a small building that smelled of pine and wood smoke, and the particular intimacy of a community that knew all its own business. The minister was a Reverend Horace Crane, a small, precise man who conducted the ceremony with a combination of gravity and genuine warmth that Theodora appreciated. There were perhaps 15 people in the pews. Ranch hands, neighbors from 2 or 3 spreads over, the proprietor of the general store in town, and his wife, and old Pete in the cleanest shirt she had ever seen him in. Mrs. Briggs sat in the front row with her hands folded, and her expression suggesting she approved, but was not going to make a fuss about it. Daniel stood beside Marcus as his witness, straight and steady, and when Theodora walked down the aisle, she looked first at Marcus, who was watching her with an expression that made something in her chest turn over completely, and then briefly at Daniel, who was looking at Marcus with an expression that held something private, and then cleared into something simply good, simply glad. And she thought that Daniel Slater was one of the finest people she had ever met, and that she would spend a long time being grateful for him. She stood beside Marcus and said her vows in a clear, steady voice, and heard his said back in a voice that was low and sure, and Reverend Crane pronounced them married, and Marcus Slater kissed her for the first time, brief and warm, and there was not a single person in that room who looked away. Afterwards there was a small supper at the ranch, Mrs. Briggs having prepared enough food to suggest she had been planning this since approximately the moment Theodora arrived. The ranch hands came in from the cold, and the general store proprietor's wife, whose name was June Hargrove, turned out to have strong opinions about music and a fiddle in her bag, and by 8 o'clock in the evening the parlor had been reorganized for dancing, and the fire was built up high, and the room was full of the sound of people being genuinely happy. Marcus danced with her twice, which was twice more than she had expected from a man who had confessed to her that he had avoided any room that played music for 3 years, and he held her correctly, hand at her waist, a proper distance, but the way he looked at her while they danced was not proper distance at all. It was something concentrated and certain, and she met it without looking away, and felt herself begin to understand what it would mean to be truly known by this man, what it would feel like when that was fully underway, and the feeling was tremendous. Daniel danced with Mrs. Hargrove, and then with the wife of one of the neighboring ranchers, a woman named Clara Finch, who was young and bright-eyed, and who appeared to be paying a great deal of attention to Daniel, in a way that Daniel had not yet noticed because Daniel, she had come to understand, was not good at noticing things directed at himself. She filed that away with quiet satisfaction as something that might resolve itself in its own good time. It was late when the guests went home, when the last ranch hand drifted back to the bunkhouse, when Mrs. Briggs went to her room with a nod that contained more warmth than anything she had said all evening. Daniel was the last one in the parlor, banking the fire, and as she came through on her way to bed she paused. "Thank you," she said, "for everything you started." He looked up from the fireplace. "I just drove a wagon." "You came back and told him he had to go himself," she said. "I didn't know about that until Marcus told me last week." Something quiet crossed his face. He had come back from that wagon ride, apparently, and sat down with Marcus and told him something Marcus had not wanted to hear, which was that the woman waiting at the station was not a woman you could keep at arm's length, not a woman you could manage from a careful distance. He had told Marcus that she was real and present, and that if Marcus let his fear make him small again, he would regret it for the rest of his life. He needed to hear it, Daniel said simply. He did, she agreed. "And I needed you to be honest enough to say it." She paused. "Are you all right, truly?" He met her eyes, and they were clear and honest and settled. "I'm good," he said. "I genuinely am. Tonight helped." She smiled. "Clara Finch danced with you 3 times. He looked startled, which was exactly as satisfying as she had expected. She did, Theodora said. "And she is a very capable woman with a good smile, and she clearly has more sense than you are currently giving her credit for." Daniel stared at her for a moment, and then he laughed, low and genuine, the kind of laugh that comes out when something lands exactly right. "Go to bed," he said. "Good night, Daniel," she said. "Good night, Mrs. Slater," he said, and she walked down the hall with the title settling around her shoulders like something she had been waiting to wear for a very long time. Winter on the Kansas prairie was nothing like winter in Cincinnati. She had known cold in the city, the wet cold that came off the river and sank into the streets, but this was a different thing entirely, a vast dry cold that came out of the north with nothing to stop it for 1,000 miles, that found every gap and crack and made the wood walls sing. She learned to respect it, to layer properly, to check the livestock before the temperature fell in the evenings, to keep the kitchen range going at all times. She and Marcus moved through those first married weeks with a carefulness that was not distance anymore but something else, a mutual understanding that what they were building required attention and patience and could not be rushed. They talked in the evenings, long conversations by the parlor fire that ranged across everything. He told her about growing up on this land, about his father who had been hard and fair and had built the ranch from nothing, about Daniel who was 6 years younger and had always been the easier one, the one who laughed, the one the hands liked best. He told her about Abilene with an honesty that she recognized as costing him something, and she listened without jealousy because she understood that the past was not competition, it was context. She told him about Cincinnati and about the Ledger, and about the matrimonial advertisement she had answered in a moment that was half calculation and half something she did not have a name for yet. She told him about the train ride and how the land had opened up as she came west, and how it had frightened and awed her in equal measure. He listened to all of it. He was a good listener, which she had not expected, and when he asked questions they were the right questions, the ones that showed he had heard not just the words but the weight of things. In January he taught her to ride, which she had not done properly before. She had been on horseback twice in her life, side saddle, in the Cincinnati Park, which bore no relationship to working a horse on a Kansas ranch. He was a patient teacher, precise without being condescending, and she learned fast because she always learned fast and because she wanted to be useful. The first day she rode out with him across the snow-covered range, both of them bundled in everything they owned against the cold, and the horses moved through the white quiet, and the sky above was that impossible winter blue. She felt something so large and glad inside her chest that she thought she might have to say something embarrassing about it. She didn't say anything. But she reached over as they rode side by side and put her gloved hand briefly over his gloved hand where it rested on the saddle horn, and he looked at her with those green eyes warm as June in the January cold, and that was enough. February brought a crisis. One of the neighboring ranchers, a man named Bernard Cole who ran a larger spread to the northwest, had been having a water dispute with the Slater ranch for 2 seasons. Cole had diverted a creek that ran across both properties, and the winter of 1879 was making it critical because the cattle needed that water source. He came to the ranch one afternoon with 2 of his men, and the conversation in the yard was not friendly. Theodora watched from the kitchen window and saw the way Marcus held himself, the controlled anger, the jaw set tight. She saw Cole's gesturing hands and the aggressive lean of a man who was used to winning through size. She pulled on her coat and went out. Marcus saw her coming and something in his expression flickered, but she walked calmly across the yard to stand beside him, and she looked at Cole with the same direct, level gaze she used for poorly kept ledgers. "Mr. Cole," she said, "I wonder if you've consulted the county water rights filings from the original survey, because the Branch Creek in question is actually recorded as a shared waterway in the 1869 territorial filing, which means neither of you has exclusive diversion rights." Cole stared at her. His men stared at her. Marcus stared at her with an expression that was entirely different from the other two, something that was working hard to stay neutral. "I found the filings in the county record copies when I was organizing the ranch papers last month," she continued pleasantly. "I'm happy to get the relevant documents for you to review. I'm also happy to propose a sharing arrangement for the spring and summer months that could work for both operations if you'd find that useful." Cole looked at her, then at Marcus, then back at her. He was not a stupid man, and she could see him calculating. "Your wife," he said to Marcus. "My wife," Marcus confirmed, and there was something in how he said it. Cole huffed, but he was less aggressive than he had been 30 seconds before. "Fine, "Bring the papers, we'll talk." He rode out, and Marcus waited until he was well down the track before he turned to her, and the expression on his face now that it was not being controlled was large and warm and slightly undone. "You organized all the county filings," he said. "They were in the ledger box," she said. "Honestly, Marcus, the filing system in this house was a genuine concern." He looked at her for another moment, and then he put both hands on either side of her face and kissed her in the middle of the yard in the February cold, which was warm and definite and left her entirely without precision for approximately 30 seconds, which was a record. "You are remarkable," he said, when he pulled back. "The filing system is better now," she said, because she needed to say something ordinary or she was going to be entirely undone, and she had a reputation to maintain. He laughed, and the laugh was warm and full, and she filed it in the same place she filed the smile from the coffee morning, the place she was going to keep coming back to forever. The water dispute was resolved in March, with papers, with the county official, with a shared use agreement that Theodora drafted herself and both men signed in the general store in front of witnesses. Cole shook her hand at the end of it, which was not nothing from a man like Cole, and she drove home beside Marcus in the spring sunshine, feeling something she recognized after a moment as pride, the clean, uncomplicated kind. Spring came to the Kansas plains like an announcement, everything that had been brown and dormant suddenly insisting on green, the sky lifting somehow, the light getting longer and more golden at the edges. She had heard about prairie springs, and she had not been prepared for how aggressive and beautiful they were, how the land seemed to be making up for lost time. Daniel, who had spent the winter being quietly friendly and helpfully around and not saying anything about Clara Finch, showed up one April morning with the expression of a man who had information and was not sure how to deliver it. "Clara Finch is coming to the church social on Saturday," he said at breakfast. Theodora kept her eyes on her coffee. "Is she?" "I thought I might go," he said, "to the social." "Church socials are important community events," Marcus said from behind the newspaper. "Everyone should attend." "Marcus," Theodora said. "I'm just saying," Marcus said. "You should go," Theodora told Daniel, looking up at him. "You should definitely go, and you should ask Clara Finch to walk with you afterward, because she is very good company and spring in Kansas deserves to be enjoyed with good company." Daniel looked at her with those honest eyes, and she could see him settling something in himself, the last of whatever had been complicated becoming simply simple. "You think so?" "I know so," she said. He went to the social, and he came back with grass stains on his knee, which suggested the walk had extended beyond the church grounds into the meadow, and he looked like someone who had been handed something he had not expected to get and was still figuring out what to do with it. "Well," Theodora said. "She's very direct," he said with a slightly wondering expression. "She just says things." "How terrible," Marcus said. Daniel looked at him and then at Theodora and then at both of them together, and something about what he saw made him look briefly like he might say something serious, and then he just smiled and went to wash up before supper. The ranch work of spring was enormous and consuming, and Theodora was in the middle of it. She had been keeping the books all winter, and now she added supply ordering to her work, going to town twice a month, establishing relationships with the merchants, learning which suppliers were reliable and which needed watching. She took Mrs. Briggs's suggestion and planted a kitchen garden on the south side of the house, which was a practical operation that also turned into something she loved, the specific satisfaction of things growing where you put them. One morning in late April, kneeling in the turned earth and putting in seeds, she looked up and saw Marcus leaning on the fence watching her, and the way he was watching her was something she had been learning the language of all winter, the particular attention he gave things that mattered to him. "Come help," she said. "I don't know anything about gardens. I'll show you." He came and knelt beside her in the dirt, which was clearly not something he had done recently based on his expression, and she put seeds in his hand and showed him the spacing and depth, and he did it with the same careful competence he brought to everything else. His knee was touching hers and neither of them mentioned it. "Theodora," he said while they were planting. "Marcus," she said, "I'm glad I sent Daniel to the station instead of going myself." She looked up, surprised by this. "Are you?" "Because if I'd gone myself, I would have been armored and careful, and you would have met the guarded version of me. Daniel had no defenses to put up on my behalf." He pressed a seed into the earth with one finger, focused on it. "You saw me through his eyes before you saw me through mine. I think that was better." She thought about this, about the man on the platform in his hat and his brown eyes and his frank honesty, and the way she had seen in him a window through which something else was visible, something larger and more complicated and more worth getting to know. "I think you're right," she said. He looked at her then, and the spring morning was all around them, and she could see everything she had been filing away since October laid out in him, the grief and the humor and the stubborn goodness, and the extraordinary capacity for attention that he'd been pointing at cattle and ledgers, and was now, unmistakably, pointing at her. "I love you," he said simply. The way she had come to understand, he said things that were important without flourish, without building up to it. She felt it land the way things land when they are both expected and a surprise, both something you already knew and something entirely new. She put her hand over his in the dirt. "I love you," she said back, and meant it completely, and felt in the meaning of it every column and row of the ledger of her life, all the things that hadn't added up before adding up now, finding their right sum. He brought her hand to his mouth and kissed it, dirt and all, and she laughed, and the spring morning was warm and large around them, and the garden would grow. The summer of 1879 was a good one for the Slater ranch. The water arrangement with coal held, and the cattle were healthy, and the summer rains came in their right season, and the grass was good. Marcus and Theodora worked alongside each other in the way of two people who have discovered that they function well in the same space, who have learned the rhythms of each other's habits and requirements and found them compatible. She was happy. She would not have said it to just anyone, not in those words, because she had never quite trusted happiness the way she trusted precision. But it was there, solid and daily, in the coffee in the morning and the evenings by the fire and the way his hand found hers when they walked, in the arguments they had about ranch business that were brisk and occasionally heated and always resolved, in the weight of him in the chair across from her reading while she worked the accounts, in everything. Daniel and Clara Finch were firmly committed to each other by June, which had involved two very earnest and slightly awkward conversations with Clara's father, a rancher named Thomas Finch who had 6 daughters and an air of permanent evaluation. Theodora had liked Thomas Finch immediately and had helped smooth the conversation by the simple application of being herself, which apparently had a disarming effect on evaluative fathers in a way she had never exploited back in Cincinnati and was now exploiting freely. Clara was, as Theodora had suspected, excellent. She was forthright and funny and genuinely kind in a practical way, the way of someone who grew up understanding that the best love is the kind that shows up with its sleeves rolled up. She and Theodora became friends quickly, the way direct people become friends when they find each other, the relieved recognition of someone who speaks the same language. On a Sunday afternoon in July, when Marcus and Daniel had ridden out together to check the north fence line, and she and Clara were sitting on the porch with lemonade and the kind of comfortable silence that only good friends can manage, Clara said, "You know he talks about you constantly." "Marcus," Theodora said, surprised. "Daniel," Clara said, "when I first met him, 2 of the first 3 things he told me about his life were about you. Not romantically," she added quickly, with a directness that Theodora appreciated. "More like gratitude, like you'd done something that mattered to him." Theodora thought about the stable doorway in November, about the honest, difficult thing Daniel had said, about the choice he had made to give that feeling distance and let something better grow in the space he cleared. "He did something that mattered to me too," she said. "We're even." Clara smiled, and they let the afternoon sit quietly around them, warm and gold, and full of the particular feeling of a life that has opened into something larger than you planned for. In August, Theodora discovered she was going to have a child. She knew it the way you know things when your body has been yours long enough to understand its changes, and she waited 3 weeks before she was certain, because she was precise about these things. And then she told Marcus on a Tuesday evening, which revised her position on Tuesdays considerably. She told him in the kitchen while he was going over the fall supply list, and he looked up from the paper and went very still in the way of someone who has just understood something large. And then he stood up and came around the table, and she had expected him to say something, had been curious about what he would say, and instead he put his arms around her completely and held her, just held her, his face in her hair. And she felt him breathe in a long, unsteady way that she understood was the past releasing some of its grip. "All right?" she asked, her voice muffled in his shoulder. "All right," he said, and his voice was rough and certain. "More than all right, are you?" "I'm very all right," she said, and she was. He told Daniel that evening out of her sight, but she heard the whoop Daniel let out through 2 closed doors and smiled at her knitting. The autumn passed in the good, busy way of a ranch in fall, roundup and supply ordering, and the careful work of preparing for winter. She rode out with Marcus 3 times a week even as November came in cold, because she had learned to love the land from horseback the way he had always loved it, the enormous sky and the particular quality of light in the late afternoon, and the way the cattle moved in the grass like a slow brown tide. Mrs. Briggs fussed at her each time she came back cold and declined to fuss back because Mrs. Briggs's fussing was, she had come to understand, its own kind of love. Daniel proposed to Clara in October, on horseback in the meadow where their walk had gone that first church social, and Clara had said yes before he finished the sentence, which Daniel reported to Theodora with the slightly dazed expression of a man who had been prepared for more negotiation. Their wedding was in December, a year and a day after Theodora and Marcus's, in the same church with many of the same people and Mrs. Hargrove's fiddle again, and this time Theodora stood in the front pew with Marcus's arm warm around her shoulders and watched Daniel at the altar turn to look at Clara coming down the aisle, and the expression on his face was everything. She thought about the train platform, about the man in the hat who had been leaning against the wall waiting for her, about the frank and decent person who had driven her 3 hours across the winter prairie and told her the truth and then done the harder thing, which was to decide what the truth required of him and do that too. She thought you could trace almost everything good in her life in Kansas to that afternoon, to his extraordinary eyes and the way he had said, without drama, "I don't fully know why he didn't come. I know what he told me. I'm not certain it was the whole story." Honesty was the right framework. It always had been. She squeezed Marcus's hand and he looked down at her, and they were quiet together in the warm church as Daniel and Clara said their vows, and it was one of the most complete feelings she had ever had. Thomas Slater arrived on the 4th of March, 1880, in a snowstorm, because he was his father's child and apparently could not manage an ordinary entrance. He was loud and red-faced and possessed of an immediately apparent determination, and the doctor from town said he was perfectly healthy and perfectly large, and Marcus held him for the first time with the expression of someone encountering a wonder they had not known was available. "He looks like you," Marcus said, looking at Theodora over the top of the bundled baby's head, and his voice was rough in the way she loved. "He has your chin," she said. "He has your precision," Marcus said. "Look at how he's studying everything already. He's 3 hours old. He's taking stock," Marcus said. "Definitely your child." Laughed, which made Thomas Slater squawk indignantly, and the room was warm and full and everything was entirely right. Daniel and Clara came in the spring, and Clara held Thomas while Daniel stood next to Marcus in the doorway of the nursery, and they were quiet in the way of brothers who had been through the same country and come out somewhere they had both needed to be. "You're going to be unbearable about this, aren't you?" Daniel said. "Absolutely," Marcus said. "All right," Daniel said. "Fair enough." Clara looked up from Thomas with a glowing expression and said, "We have our own news." And Theodora looked at her and understood immediately and felt a happiness that was almost architectural in its completeness, the feeling of a life that has been built well and is holding everything it was made to hold. The summer of 1880 was golden in every sense. Thomas grew at an alarming rate and demonstrated early and firmly that he had his mother's focus and his father's will, a combination that Mrs. Briggs said with great satisfaction was going to make him an absolute terror by the age of 5. The ranch was doing better than it had done in years, the accounts balanced and clean in Theodora's neat columns, the supply arrangements efficient, the coal-water agreement working smoothly enough that Cole had stopped by twice for coffee and turned out to be a man who was perfectly decent once you removed the aggression of contested resources. Old Pete told Theodora one afternoon in the barn, where she had come to discuss the state of the horse stock with him, that this was the best the ranch had been since before the senior Slater died, and he said it with the authority of someone who had been watching this piece of land for 20 years. She thanked him and he waved it off and returned to his work, and she stood for a moment in the barn doorway looking at the summer land, and felt something that was not quite gratitude and not quite triumph, and was entirely its own fine thing. Clara and Daniel's son was born in September, and they named him William, and he had Daniel's dark eyes and Clara's forthright expression from approximately the first week of his life. The two families spent Sundays together with a regularity that made Theodora feel, for the first time since her mother died, the particular warmth of a genuine extended life, of being known by and connected to people who chose you. In the fall of 1880, Marcus bought the additional pasture land to the east that he had been considering for years, which was the right decision by every measure in the accounts, and which he had delayed because it required a significant investment, and he had been cautious by habit for a long time. He made the decision at the kitchen table after supper one October evening, looking at the numbers she had laid out for him, and she watched the moment he stopped being cautious about it and became simply decisive. "Do it," she said. He looked up. "You're sure? The numbers are clear, more to the point you have wanted to for 2 years. He held her gaze. "Think desire is a valid argument. I think desire that agrees with the numbers is an excellent argument," she said. "And it does. Look at column 3. He looked at column 3 and then looked at her and said, "How did I do the books before you?" "Badly," she said pleasantly. He bought the land. The following spring it was carrying healthy cattle and the numbers were correct, and he told her she had been right, which she already knew, but the telling was its own satisfaction. They had their disagreements. It would be dishonest to suggest otherwise, and honesty was still the framework. They disagreed about the best approach to the winter feed situation in 1880, and the argument lasted 3 days and ended with her being right, but his approach having a practical advantage she had not accounted for, so they used a combination of both, which she found satisfying in a different way. They disagreed about whether Thomas should be allowed to sit on the saddle at 18 months, which was a different kind of argument that ended with her winning entirely. They disagreed about whether to hire an additional hand in the spring of 1881, and she was right about that too, though she was getting better at not leading with "I told you so." They never disagreed about what mattered. They never disagreed about the quality of what they had built, or about the choice they had each made, or about the particular strange grace of a life that had come together the way theirs had, out of caution and fear, and a wagon ride across the winter prairie, and a woman who looked at bad filing systems the way other people looked at challenges to be refused. In the winter of 1881, when Thomas was almost 2 and walking with his father's deliberate stride and his mother's slightly dangerous look of focus, and when Clara was expecting again, and the ranch was doing well, and Daniel had turned out to be every bit as good with cattle as he was with horses and honesty, Theodora sat one evening in the parlor with her mending, and Marcus sat across from her with a book he wasn't reading, and the fire was good. And outside, the prairie wind was running its old eternal complaint against the walls, and the house was holding. She looked at him over the top of her mending, and he looked at her over the top of his book, and neither of them said anything, because there was nothing that needed saying. Everything that needed saying had been said, in 4 careful letters and a wagon ride, and a kitchen table conversation about ledgers, and a parlor conversation about promises and a garden in the dirt, and a Tuesday evening in August and 1,000 ordinary evenings by the fire. All of it said and meant and remembered and current. He set the book down, and she set the mending down, and they sat in the quiet, in the warm, in the fullness of it, and Thomas's small sounds from his room came through the wall, and the fire cracked, and the wind ran across the plains as it always had, touching everything and settling nowhere. And in this house it found itself resisted by something that would not move, something that had been built carefully and honestly and with real love, and would stand. She was thinking, later that winter, about what she would tell Thomas when he was old enough to ask how his parents had come to be together in this place. She would tell him the truth, because that was always what she told. She would tell him that his father sent his brother to meet the bride, and his brother came back alone, and he said, "You have to go yourself." And she would tell him that the brother was right, that going yourself is always the thing, that showing up in person with all your fear and your history and your complicated heart is the only way anything real gets built. That you cannot send someone else to live your life, no matter how much you trust them, because the life requires you specifically, your hands and your attention and your willingness to be known. And she would tell him that she had been on a train platform in Abilene, Kansas, in October of 1878, with a leather trunk and a wool coat and a collection of precisely calibrated expectations. And a man in a hat had come to her across the platform and looked at her with honest dark eyes and begun, without knowing it, everything. She would tell him that the Kansas sky was the biggest thing she had ever seen, and that she had learned to love it the way you learn to love anything enormous and indifferent, by being in it long enough that it becomes familiar, by being in it until you understand that you are part of it too. She would tell him that love was not the neat ledger she had thought it would be. It was messier and larger and more demanding and far more rewarding, and it was worth every mile of the train ride and every cold October wind and every evening of careful conversation, and she would not have organized a single column of it differently. She thought about all of this, looking into the fire while Marcus read, and the house kept the cold outside where it belonged. And she was so entirely glad, so completely and particularly glad, that she had done the brave and terrifying thing and gotten on the train. Spring came again, as it always came to the Kansas plains, with its enormous green insistence, its demand to be noticed and celebrated. The garden on the south side of the house came back with the determination of something that has established itself and intends to continue. The cattle moved through the new grass, and Thomas sat in front of his father on horseback and pointed at things with one small imperative finger. Clara had a girl this time, who they named Margaret, and who arrived in April with a head of dark hair and an expression of serene authority that promised an interesting future. Theodora planted new rows in the garden, and Marcus helped her the way he always helped her now, kneeling in the dirt without complaint, knowing the spacing and depth because he had done it every spring for 2 years, and they worked side by side in the April sun, while Thomas chased a butterfly across the lawn with all the focused intensity of a child who has decided something matters. Daniel came around the corner of the house with Margaret bundled against his shoulder, since Clara was resting, and he watched his nephew pursue the butterfly and said to no one in particular, "That child has no idea how to lose interest in something." "I wonder where he gets that," Marcus said, looking at Theodora. "I am not responsible for his entire personality," she said. "Column 3, Marcus said." She threw a handful of dirt at him, which he ducked, grinning, and Daniel stepped back to protect the baby and said something to Margaret in a low, reassuring voice. and the morning was brilliant and warm around all of them. And the garden was going in, and the ranch was good, and the sky above the Kansas plains was the most beautiful, ridiculous, enormous thing, stretching from one edge of everything to the other with the confidence of a thing that knows exactly what it is, and below it. On a Tuesday in April of 1882, 4 years and a full life away from a train platform in Abilene, Theodora Keating Slater put a seed in the earth and covered it carefully and pressed it down with both hands and thought that this, all of this, was exactly the right answer.